Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today, I'm very happy to be speaking with an author whose work I've been enjoying for about a decade now. I discovered his work in my early 20s, I think, because my dad, Jeff Miras, had reviewed his book, What We Can't Not Know, at Catholic Culture. And I think he sent me his copy. I read it. Then I read his follow-up, The Meaning of Sex, and started reading his blog, which he still writes to this day at undergroundthomist.org. At the time, I think my dad said believed him to be the best natural law philosopher working today. And I have to say that I kind of agree with that. So today I'll be speaking with J Budziszewski. Okay, I think I got it right. Professor of Government and Philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. As I mentioned, he's the author of What We Can't Not Know, which is a book on the natural law, and The Meaning of Sex, which follows sort of the same method to focus in on sexual morality in particular. Both wonderful books, and quite a number of other books, both in a more academic and a more popular vein. And his newest book is How and How Not to Be Happy, published by Regnery Gateway. And so I'm very happy to welcome onto the show J Budziszewski. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you.
One of the things that is a hallmark of your work to me, granted I haven't read your academic work so much, but the astonishing clarity of your writing, dealing with, some heavy philosophical ideas, it's really, really lucid and clear. And there's only a couple of other contemporary writers that I can compare you to in that. One that comes to mind would be Thomas Sowell, who's somebody who can talk about, the intricacies of statistics and make it just very, very clear and concise. And you have that same ability. So I'm a little bit curious about how you managed to do that.
Oh, well, when I started out, I wasn't able to do that, and I thank you. That's a kind compliment. I work at it very hard. I remember one of my first books. I sent it around to something like 17 places, trying to get it published. And finally, a really kind and generous editor at a trade press said, I really like this book. I wish I could publish it, but you aren't writing it so that ordinary people can understand it. And he made a few suggestions. Well, that book wasn't published by his press. It was eventually published by somebody else. But I learned a lot, and I began taking this to heart and trying to understand it. After all, I'm a teacher, for goodness sake. I ought to be able to write so that people can understand. And one of the things that I've found, as a matter of fact, is that this has been good for me, too, because there are some people who can't teach about something until they understand it, until they think they understand it perfectly, which nobody ever does. I find that the way that I come to understand something is by trying to understand how I would teach it. It's the other way around for me. So this has been very helpful. And after years in this, I mean, I've been around since the dinosaurs. You learn a few things. You mentioned my academic books. I try to do this in my academic books too. I try to make them accessible to general readers. If I were writing about particle physics, I don't think that would be so important. But for goodness sake, we're talking about things like the ethical foundations of social life. That's something we're all in together.
Right.
Now, if
right.
I can't make it useful to all of us who are in it together, it seems like I'm wasting my time.
Yeah. Well, man, there's so many questions I have for you about your approach to your work, but maybe we can go ahead and talk about the new book first.
Sure.
How and How Not to Be Happy. Now, you've written a number of books on the natural law, and those have been focused primarily on morality. In this one, you focus on happiness. So what made you decide to tackle that topic instead?
Yeah, well, in the first place, it's not unrelated to morality. When I first began writing, this was the more scholarly stuff. This is the more academic stuff. When I first began writing line-by-line commentaries on sections of the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas, I started with the treatise on law because that dealt with the natural moral law. And then I realized that I wasn't going to be able to fully explain this unless I went back and talked about his virtue ethics. So I did another commentary on that. And I wasn't going to be able to fully explain or even understand his virtue ethics unless I understood his doctrine of happiness. It's all wrapped up together. So after writing 666 pages about his treatise on happiness and ultimate purpose, line by line by line, I thought, well, I know an awful lot of people who are desperately unhappy. A lot of my students are desperately unhappy. People need to know this. I need to write a treatment that is accessible to general readers, and get it out there. So that was part of the connection. Also, I have another reflective motive in this. When I was a young man, I was very, very unhappy at one point in my life. Paradoxically, this wasn't so much after I left the faith, but after I came back to the faith, and I thought that I'd ruined myself. What could God do with me anymore? And I really wanted to die. And I was very unhappy. So I've learned something. I've been on the other side of this happiness divide, and I want to talk about having a flourishing life, about what this is about what this means. And I want to encourage people, young people especially, not to give up. And I want to encourage people not to settle, which is something I talk about in the book.
Right. It's interesting. So I just started reading Aristotle for the first time, and I finished Nicomachean Ethics almost right before beginning your book. So it was very timely. Now I'm about to start the Politics, but
I'm using his method, really.
Right. Yeah. So it's very interesting. But you just mentioned you didn't want people to settle, and that is kind of almost the main body of this book is going through what could happiness be this? Could happiness be this? And again, as you said, using the Aristotelian method of sort of showing how these things are maybe necessary for happiness, or they might be components of happiness, but are they happiness itself? So could you give us a taste of your method here?
Yeah, what you say is correct. I would say that that those are the questions that he's asking. As to the method, I'd like to put it this way. Aristotle is the same thing is true of Thomas Aquinas, although people don't always notice it because of his particular style and the genre of the scholastic disputation. The classical writers did not have contempt for the common sense of the plain person, as many people do today. And so they always began with common sense, with commonly accepted opinions, or the opinions of people who are commonly accounted to be wise. And but they didn't end with these common opinions. They then tried to, well, as one philosopher once put it, to assemble reminders, to use one part of common opinion to interrogate another common opinion and say, do you really believe that? And to try to purge it of inconsistencies and impurities and elevate it and ennoble it to something higher. That, I think, is, some people call that dialectical. I don't usually use that word because people think it means something like Hegel and Marx, which is an altogether different thing. But if you mean this process of beginning with common sense and letting it cross-examine itself, connecting the dots, something like an extended thoughtful conversation, that's the method, and that's what I try to do.
So maybe you could pick one of those topics, like one of those things that people might think happiness is, and show us how you
Oh, sure. Yeah. There is one very, very simple example might be the very, very common idea that happiness lies in wealth. In our day, people are ashamed to admit, well, many people are ashamed, not everybody's ashamed to admit, people are ashamed to admit that they think that happiness lies in wealth, but an awful lot of them are. If I ask
all our movies, so many of our movies, the message is, oh, happiness doesn't lie in wealth. So it's like a commonly accepted thing in our pop culture that wealth doesn't bring happiness.
That it doesn't bring happiness, and yet people still think that it does. If I ask my students, why did you choose your college major? So often the answer is because they don't say because I wanted a profession that I'd be able to make a living for my family and it was interesting, or I thought the work would be worthwhile. They say, well, I thought I'd make a lot of money there and I wanted to pull down the big bucks. Now, you're right that the second of the three parts of the book, the bulk of the book, is going through these rabbit trails that lead to ruin. But in every error, including the idea that happiness lies in wealth, there is some grain of truth. If there weren't, Nobody could find the error plausible. In the case of wealth, the grain of truth that makes it plausible at first is that we are embodied beings. We're not just drifting disembodied intellects. We have bodies. We have material needs. We need to eat. We need to put food on the table. We need shelters over our heads. We need to be able to clothe our children. Sure, we have material needs. Now, does it follow from that the more material stuff you have, the happier you're going to be, and that if you get enough of it, you're going to be completely happy? It certainly does not. And as a matter of fact, material wealth is one of the things that Aristotle, whom we've mentioned, had in mind when he said good fortune, when it comes in excess, might better be called bad fortune. Think of all the people who won the lottery, and then their lives just go to pieces. You need virtue to know what to do with wealth, when to stop, when to say, I've got enough. More of it is not going to be good for me. And of course, that same virtue is going to help you when you come into adversity. So there's there's one classical answer that used to be given, and I don't think it's enough. Aristotle said, Thomas Aquinas said, a lot of the other classical thinkers have said, if you ask people, do you want wealth for its own sake, or do you want wealth for the sake of something else? And they all say, oh, I want it for the sake of something else. And then the answer comes, well, then it isn't happiness, is it? What that other thing is. But it sort of misses the point, because they think that they can buy the things that will make them happy. They still think that even though wealth itself is not happiness, they think it's the key to happiness. Or at least they think it's the most important thing. There's that line in the Gospels that seek first the kingdom of God, and all of these other things will be given to you. And people seem to think, seek first wealth, and all of these other things will be given to you. But it just isn't true. Suicide rates are much higher in wealthy, high-status communities than in middle-class communities. They're low among the destitute, too. People are hungry. But, they're high, among the destitute, too. But then they dip in the middle class, and they go way up again among the wealthy.
Yeah, that brings up a point.
That would be an example.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
That brings up a point. You make a judicious use of, examples from modern social science and studies and, popular opinions in our culture and, quotes from song lyrics and things. And it's all done in such a way that it doesn't distract from the sort of the core philosophy that, that you're doing in the book. But I particularly like the way you bring in, always seems to be the right data point that you bring in, like you just mentioned, suicide rates. In another one you talked about, I can't remember what it was exactly, but you were talking about people who live in wealthy neighborhoods. It might have been that same point, that they're the stressors of sort of envy and trying to keep up with everybody else, and the immense social pressures that exist in a wealthy neighborhood.
Yes. Yes. One writer says that wealthy, high-status neighborhoods are like living in middle school forever. That's one of the most chilling things that I've ever written,
right?
Or rather read.
Right. So, but I like how you bring those things in, and Aristotle did the same thing. Sure. He actually cited. You mentioned in your introduction him mentioning some famous wrestler. At the
Milo.
time, and
Milo the wrestler. I figure if Aristotle can do it, well, why can't a little guy like me do it? No, one has to be careful, because you can't use anecdotes to prove a thesis, but you can use anecdotes to illustrate a thesis.
Right.
And you commented on using statistics judiciously. That's important to me, because I think that statistics have to be taken with a grain of salt.
Right.
A lot of people fling statistics around, especially the statistical results of self-administered, subjective self-report happiness surveys. Are you happy now? What makes you happy? And I think this data is not to be trusted. But on the other hand, somebody may be mistaken about how happy he is at the moment or what makes him happy. But I think if he commits suicide, we can be pretty sure that he's unhappy.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying. Like, it's judicious because you're using it in the proper place. And so it makes it very satisfying and a holistic experience to read it, because it's not just abstract arguments, but the concrete examples are given in their proper place and given their proper amount of space. You know, they don't overwhelm, you know, the fundamental argument that's being made.
Well, I'm glad you think so. You know, there was one, when I was doing my research, I came across one book on self-esteem, which is another one of the fallacies, that self-esteem will make you happy. But the author of a book on self-esteem was being reviewed by another person who criticized her for doing that, for using illustrations from the pop culture for her points. He called it the detritus of popular culture. Well, this is the culture that we live in. We're trying to talk about the attitudes that people actually have and what happens to them when they try to live by those attitudes. Of course, we have to talk about the popular culture.
Right. Right.
We don't have to descend to the level of the pop culture queens who ride on wrecking balls naked, but we can talk about these things as illustrating certain points of view, certain attitudes, and the consequences of them.
One thing I find very interesting about the classical philosophy, and Aristotle in particular, is, and it may be counterintuitive for Catholics who are used to thinking about, well, happiness is a matter of spiritual things, if you're virtuous and if you love God, then you'll be happy. And the classical point of view, even the classical Catholic point of view, doesn't necessarily agree with that. That
right.
virtue does not consist in happiness. So why is virtue not happiness? Why isn't virtue its own reward in the ultimate sense?
That's one of the noblest mistakes, the idea that virtue alone will make you happy. But the wisest thinkers, and including, contrary to popular belief, Christian and Catholic thinkers, as you point out, have realized that this isn't true. You know, if you are virtuous, but somebody is barbecuing you on the rack as an instrument of torture, as happened to one of the saints, if you've been exiled and you've lost all of your friends, it's unlikely that you're going to be happy, or at least very happy. So we do need good fortune too, and even that's not the end of it. But at least this is true about happiness. About virtue. Without the virtues, we're sure not going to be happy. They enable us to know what to do with good fortune that comes our way. They enable us to bear up under misfortune. Now, toward the end of the long second part of the book, I even call this the worldly wise man's view of happiness. Not just virtue alone, but virtue plus good fortune, virtue plus luck. And it's not a complete answer to the problem of happiness. It has a certain heft. Most people would agree that it's, but I develop a critique of this too. Still, it has some heft to it. There is some substance to it. We certainly need to practice the virtues. They're just not a magic key. Be good and everything will be happy. You know, religious people often make this mistake because they think God is promising them that if they pray and if they love God and if they seek God, they will be happy all the time. I've even had people say to me, you know, I go to church, I go to Mass, I pray to God, I long for God, but I'm not fulfilled. Well, of course you're not fulfilled. We aren't going to be fulfilled until we see His face. And that's not going to happen in this life. So in this life, we're going to have unfulfilled longings, even if we have all the things that people think are the good things, even if we have enough wealth so that we're not starving, and even if we can feed our children, we have friends, we have meaningful work, we have all of these kinds of things. There's going to be this deep unfulfilled longing that cannot be fulfilled in this life because we are not beholding the face of God Himself. St. Paul talks about this. He says we are groaning. Now, he says, all nature is groaning. It awaits its redemption. He says, now we only see as though in a mirror, dimly, but then we will see face to face. So I think that we have to distinguish between the fragmentary, incomplete, partial happiness of this life, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it is all those things, and the complete happiness which is utterly fulfilling and will leave nothing further to be desired, and which we are not going to experience until we see the face of God in the next. So while we're trying to be virtuous and hoping for good luck in this life, we ought to be seeking God with all our hearts. And another aspect of this that people often don't understand, many Catholics sort of get this. Many Catholics actually get this very well, and much better than I do, and practice it very well. But some don't, and that's that even suffering can have redemptive value. We can offer it to Christ. It can be.
But that doesn't mean we're happy when we're suffering just because we have peace and joy.
You know, St. Paul speaks of being in prison, and he's not very happy about being in prison. And he misses his friends. He longs to be with them. He's tired of the way this is going, and yet he has the joy to be able to sing hymns to his Lord. This is the possibility of the coexistence of those things is really interesting.
I mentioned that I just started reading Aristotle, and that's in the context of something I've mentioned before on the podcast, which is this online great books seminar program that I'm involved in. And so my reading of Aristotle is in the context of all these other Greek works that we've already read. And that includes Homer, that includes, some Plutarch, that includes Euripides, the great Greek tragedians, Plato, of course. And one theme that pops up constantly, especially in the Greek tragic plays, and especially in Euripides, who concludes more than one play with a variation on this, is this idea of call no man happy until he is dead. This idea attributed to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, among others. So what's your take on call no man happy until he is dead? What do you think they meant by it? What do you think truth is in it? What do you think we would mean by it if we said it as Catholics?
Well, there are a lot of theories about what they meant. Most of my students, when they first read that line in Aristotle, who quotes it, assume that he means that he's talking about the afterlife. Aristotle isn't talking about the afterlife. He's only talking about the happiness of this life. He doesn't know about the afterlife. But the way I understand him is this: look, if I'm reading a novel, you may say when I'm 3/4 of the way through the novel, is it a good book? Is it a good story? Should I go out and get a copy? Should I read it? And I might say, well, I don't know yet. Ask me when I'm finished. And you might say, well, have you been enjoying it? And I might say, well, yeah, I've enjoyed every page, but I still can't say if it's a good story. I won't know until the end if it really hangs together, if it really comes to anything, or if it just drizzles out in futility. Now, that can be true of life, too. Happiness is something abiding. Happiness is sometimes... And happiness is not just a matter of how you feel. You know, you may be feeling good. You may feel good on every day of your life, and we may have to say that was not a happy life because it was in fact based on a delusion, and you didn't know it. But this came to light after you died. So I think that there are a lot of things about that which Catholics can accept as valid, as an insight. But we have some additional layers of depth that we can add onto it.
We were talking about this idea that, virtue is happiness. And you talk about the Stoics in your book on this point. Are you familiar with this ongoing Stoic, sort of popular Stoic revival that's been happening the past several years?
Yeah, it's more than just the past several years. I think the one of the benchmarks of that was the Russell Crowe movie. What was it? Gladiator? Was that the movie?
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but
yeah, it was. Well, it's a great movie, but basically it's a Stoic ethic. And after that's quite some time ago. It's by today's everything's forgotten in 15 minutes standards. It's a pretty old movie, even though to an old geezer like me, it doesn't seem that long ago. But there was really a Stoic ethic that was sort of celebrated there, and we're seeing another rise of that now. A number of my students say, "Oh yeah, I'm reading Marcus Aurelius." Well, this is a very sorrowful kind of happiness that the Stoics were talking about. And when you ask them, they said the sage, the wise man, the completely virtuous man will be completely happy. But when you ask them, well, have you attained that? Every last one of them said no. They were honest. And it was a matter of faith that if they ever could be completely virtuous, then they'd be happy. But in the meantime, they were pretty miserable. An image, a metaphor that they sometimes offered was this: here you are, you're drowning, you're 30 feet under the water, you're drowning. Okay, here's the man without virtue, and he doesn't have happiness. Now you rise a little bit closer to the surface. You're only 20 feet from the surface. You're maybe more virtuous than you were. But you're still drowning just as much as you were before. That 10 feet makes no difference. Now you get to 10 feet from the surface. You're still drowning. Now your mouth and your nostrils are 6 inches from the surface. You're still drowning. They said it wouldn't be until you were perfectly virtuous. And they said that this would be the moment of metanoia, the moment of the change of your mind. It's the same word that we translate as repentance in the New Testament. Then there would be the conversion, the change, and you would be completely unhappy and nothing would be able to move you to unhappiness anymore. But none of them had ever experienced it. It was a point of faith. And as a matter of fact, what they actually recommended, if things got too much for you, they said commit suicide. One of the Stoics says, be like children. When the game doesn't please them, they say, I will play no more. And that should be our attitude too. But if you stay in the game, don't complain. When you look more closely at their conception of virtue, they thought that the only way that this was going to work, this idea of virtue making you completely happy, was that virtue would involve being completely independent of external circumstances. They thought that there is no evil unless the mind thinks that it's evil. If you've had your arm cut off, well, it's only evil because you think that it's evil. If your friends all desert you, it's only evil because you think that it's evil. So this would make you independent not only of your enemies, but it would actually make you independent even of your friends. And it seems to me that this isn't so much virtue as it is pride and something that looks an awful lot like despair.
Yeah, you have this remarkable quote from Seneca at the end of that chapter, and he doesn't sound very happy.
No, Augustine mocked them. Saint Augustine in his work, he said, "Oh, what happiness this is, that one has to seek the aid of death to end it." He said, "If it really is happy, then wouldn't you want to stay alive? And if you seek the aid of death to end it, how can you be said to be happy?" Everybody could see this, it seems, except the Stoics themselves.
Yeah, so I remember years ago, there's this great podcast called The History of Philosophy podcast hosted by Peter Adamson. And he did an interview with Sarah Byers, who's a professor of philosophy at Boston College and works a lot on Augustine. And she was talking about Augustine's critique of the Stoics. And it was very striking what she said is that, Augustine's belief in an afterlife allows him to be honest about sufferings in this life. And she said something like, I'm paraphrasing her, she said that Augustine basically says to the Stoics, look, like, because there's this afterlife, you don't have to lie anymore and say that it doesn't matter, if your child dies or whatever. You don't have to lie and say that you can be happy with all those things going on. That's a brilliantly good insight about the Christian life in general, about Augustine in particular. I couldn't agree more with it. I had not read this comment of hers, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. But yeah, that's certainly true. One of the most hair-raising passages that I've ever read about the ills and the sorrows of this life is in Augustine. And a non-believing person might read Augustine and think, oh, what a terrible person, what a terrible life he must have lived, how bleak everything must have been. He saw only blackness. No, he was pretty cheerful. But his eyes were fixed on that perfect happiness, which will in that. People say pie in the sky by and by, but if it really is true that God will one day wipe the tears from the eyes of the oppressed and that he keeps up our tears in a bottle, then that's something that we ought to know about, isn't it? I think it is. And it means you don't, if you're convinced, like the Stoics are, that happiness must be attainable, then you don't have to pretend like, if you know about the afterlife, that it is attainable in the afterlife, perfect happiness, that you don't have to,
Yes.
to be in denial about unhappiness in this life.
Yeah. The psychology of this kind of thing works in other areas besides happiness too. For example, I'm not the first to have made this observation, but if you don't believe that there's a God, there's a principle which is sort of self-evident, that we shouldn't do evil, right? That evil shouldn't be done even for the sake of a good result. That's the whole point of something being intrinsically evil. And intrinsic evil is something that can't be justified by any possible result. But people will say, but sometimes don't we have to play God? Don't we have to kill innocent people in order to make something good happen? Don't we have to deliberately bring about something that it would be evil to bring about? Because won't something bad happen? Well, if you don't have confidence in God, if you can't say, I'm going to let you take care of the consequences, God, you know what you're doing, then psychologically, from an intellectual point of view, it is still self-evident that evil is not to be done. But psychologically, you may feel compelled, if there's no God to take care of the consequences, then I've got to play God. I've got to make everything right, because this life is all there is, and somehow I've got to make things come out right. And you may do any atrocity whatsoever in order to try to make things right.
You mentioned your experience of teaching being an influence on your writing style, and you also, in the book, occasionally give examples of how your students, common opinion as manifested by students that you've taught. And I really wanted to ask you, because you teach at a secular university, about, this is kind of an open-ended question, but I wanted to ask you about your experience of teaching there for over the decades, and how you deal with trying to teach abiding truths to disillusioned students.
Well, it's tough, but on the other hand, it's tough to teach in a committed Christian environment too, because many of the kids who are there, they may be there because their parents just thought that they have to go there, or they may be there and be thinking, oh, these people are just droning all these platitudes in my mind. There are problems in both kinds. I think it's wonderful that there are Catholic universities, and I think some people are called to teach in them. I suspect that I'm more likely to have a calling to teach out in the secular wasteland. And it has its own challenges. But one of the things that I've been surprised to find is that although my secular students, my skeptical students, my non-believing students may not be aware of their own spiritual longings, by golly, they've got them. And if I don't bring up God in a course on a course dealing with ethics, well, they'll bring him up. Sometimes in the funniest ways. I was teaching a course once, and there was a unit on Thomas Aquinas. We were getting ready to close out the unit. We were about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through it, and a student raised his hand in class and said, "Did Thomas Aquinas believe in God?" Now, okay, if you are far enough from that perspective, even reading it right on the page, it may be hard to see it. It may be hard to take it in. It may be hard to believe it, and people may need a little help to see that. But people will ask, and I think that it's if I just tried to lay down the gospel on them, I'd be abusing my position, because they didn't pay their money to take that class for that reason. But if I can respond to questions, and if something about the gospel gives the answer to that, then I think that's perfectly reasonable. I'll tell you a story, Thomas, about a student came to me once. I had not mentioned God, but I had been teaching Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which you mentioned that you've been reading recently. And my student, he was an older returning student, he was in his 30s. He showed up at my office door during office hours, and he said, "Professor, can I talk with you?" He said, no, that's not what he said. He said, "I gotta talk with you." I said, "Well, okay, what do we gotta talk about?" He said, "Well, you're scaring me." And I said, "Well, how am I scaring you?" And he said, "Well, it isn't really you. It's this guy Aristotle that you're making us read." And I said, "Well, how's Aristotle scaring you?" And he said, "Well, in this book of his, he keeps talking about the virtues. And it's making me realize that I haven't led a virtuous life, and I'm scared.
Hmm.
And he held out his hand. He was a melodramatic guy, but I believe him. The melodramatic drama was illustrating a truth about him. His hand was trembling. He was, now, had Aristotle spoken of divine judgment, of retribution, of guilt, of God, of conviction of sin? No, what he'd been talking about is the virtues, and he'd been talking about them in connection with human flourishing. The worst that my student would have concluded is that if he didn't practice the virtues, he wasn't going to flourish. But he was trembling. That was the first that I'd realized that the Holy Spirit, could make use of an old pagan philosopher to bring about what John's Gospel calls the conviction of sin.
Wow.
So, it's always a surprise. These people, the wheat is in the fields. It's growing up. It's waiting for the harvesters.
Have you had any instances of actual conversion taking place, or I don't even mean just to the Catholic faith, but even in a more limited sense?
Yes, I've in a more limited sense, and in that sense, I've seen people become at least theists. I've seen people become Christians of some kind. I've seen people become Catholics. I've also seen people at least lose some of their barriers, some of their blinders, who had held certain stereotypes, for instance, that there couldn't possibly be any right and wrong, everything is all relative, or that even if there are some truths about this, you couldn't give any rational arguments for it, or that no intelligent person really believes in God. And then they read somebody like Thomas Aquinas and, all right, this is obviously an intelligent person. They're seeing these arguments, whether or not they can absorb and digest at that age every little wrinkle of his arguments. Still, they get the main idea, and they say, wait, there's something compelling here. Does that necessarily convert them? No, but it makes them a little bit more willing to listen. And then the next guy in the row, may be able to do more. So often I realize that by the time I talk to a student, there's somebody else who came long before me, who planted some kind of a seed, and I get a chance to water it a little bit maybe. And maybe it's not me who gets a chance to harvest it, somebody else does. And it's that's pretty thrilling, and it's pretty exciting. And even when somebody is extremely resistant and has a very closed mind, that's not necessarily a bad thing for the class. It's not good for that student, of course, but it can be a good thing for the class in odd ways. A student started screaming once in class, merely because I'd given my students didn't know what a partial birth abortion was. And I hesitated. I didn't want to dump things on them, but I said, would you like me to give you a definition? He said, yeah, they all wanted a definition. So I gave a one sentence, purely clinical, I promise you it was not emotionally loaded or value loaded, definition of the procedure. A woman starts screaming. And she was screaming about how it was only done to save the life of the mother. And I said, well, actually, that claim was made by somebody in congressional testimony about partial birth abortions recently, but he admitted afterward that he'd perjured himself. He was an abortionist, and she just started screaming louder. Well, we had been talking about the framers' ideas about passion and interest and virtue, and about their fears that passion could overcome discourse. So I just turned to the class and I said, do you see why the framers were concerned about passion in discussion? She turned off like a switch, which is very interesting because it illustrated to me, and also to many of the listeners, the other students in the class, that on the one hand, I'm sure that the woman's pain was real. What it is that she was hurting about, I don't know. I'm sure that it was real, but she was also using it strategically. She was making use of her own pain to gain points. There was another occasion in which a student became angry with me in class. Somebody had asked a question about God. It wasn't what I was lecturing about, but he'd asked a question about God, and I answered the question. And another student is getting angry, and I said, why are you angry? Well, Texas students are very polite, God bless them. And he said, I'm sorry. And I said, I'm not scolding you. I'm not saying stop being angry. I'm just asking you. I really want to know, why are you angry? He said, well, I guess it's because I disagree with you. And I said, well, I disagree with you. I'm not angry with you, so that couldn't be it, could it? And he said, well, I guess it's because I don't want to hear what you're saying. And I said, okay, well, then what we really need to talk about, and we don't need to do that right now, and you don't even have to do it with me, but what you really want to think about is not whether the answer that I gave about God or whatever we were talking about is correct. What you really need to think about is why you don't want to hear it. Now,
Wow.
that's useful. That's useful. Something was gained there.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, these are awesome stories, actually. It sounds like a real place of spiritual warfare.
Well, sometimes, most of the time, half the students are asleep and things just sort of go along smoothly.
No, but that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. I wanted to ask, and this may seem like an odd question, but a smart student who engages with a philosopher like Aristotle, but is committed to a life of vice and not interested in changing, they might incorporate his thought in perverse ways, or they might respond in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect and take it in a perverse direction. I know this is a very vague question, but I'm curious if you've seen any examples of that. Like
it's
this
not
is
vague
not
at all. No,
Yeah,
no,
okay.
I think that is absolutely true. Knowledge is a wonderful thing, but if you aren't actually seeking knowledge, then it can be a snare. It's not for nothing that St. Paul mocks the pretensions of what the world sometimes calls philosophy, the false wisdom of the world. I've had students who read the classics, but they're not really looking for the truth. They're just looking for sometimes esoteric meanings that only great scholars can find in the texts, and it's just to build up pride, you see. It's not actually to find the truth. There are people who think, oh, I'm going to read all of this because the good life is the life spent in seeking for the truth but not finding it. It's the seeking that is the good, not the finding of it, as various writers, including C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, have pointed out. That's like saying the good thing is about being hungry, not actually having a hamburger. There's also the fact that if you're trying to teach ethical philosophy to somebody who doesn't have a modicum of virtue, who isn't at least trying some to be a good person, he may use what he learns to construct clever arguments in order to evade the truth instead of to seek it. And we see that in history too. Look, when Pontius Pilate is in conversation with Jesus, and at a certain point, Jesus speaks about the truth, and Pontius Pilate says, "What is truth?" It sounds like a question, right? It wasn't. It was a conversation stopper disguised as a question. He didn't use that to begin a conversation. He used it to end a conversation, and it was at that moment that he turns on his heel and he walks out of the room. I think one of the things that we have to learn in conversation and as teachers, and we have to learn to catch ourselves at this too, because we all have at times have evaded the truth and been and out-clevered ourselves. We need the grace of God to keep us away from that. But sometimes a question is a real question, and what it needs is an honest intellectual answer. Or if we don't have the answer, what it needs is, well, I don't know, I'll help you, let's work together to find out. But sometimes a question isn't. It's a smokescreen. It's a way of being clever. It's a way of avoiding the answer. And one of the things that I've had to learn as a teacher, even as a writer, Socrates got this. It isn't just a matter of presenting a bunch of syllogisms. The dialogues sometimes sound more like the discussions of somebody with a very wise counselor. People are getting angry. They're evading things. They're changing the subject. They're committing the bizarrest fallacies of distraction. And we do this. Or you look in the Gospels. You look at Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well. it used to baffle me because it's full of what on the face of it look like non sequiturs. He doesn't exactly answer what she says in her words, and she doesn't exactly answer what he says in his words. It's a sort of a duel. He's responding to what's behind her words, and she's trying to duel, and he finally wins, and she's disarmed, and goes to the town and says, "You've got to hear this man. He knows everything about me. Do you think he could be the Messiah?" That's an amazing conversation, but it isn't the way. But it's nothing like the way that we teach young teachers to teach in pedagogy courses, just explaining things step by step and presenting syllogisms. There's other stuff going on because you're dealing with a real mind here, a real soul and a real heart, and the mind needs to be in partnership with those things and not at odds with it. Right. Now, your question was good. I think my answer was a little bit diffuse, but maybe that's a little helpful.
Yeah, I was just sort of interested in what way, because obviously not everybody who takes a philosophy class, even about a great philosopher who has a lot of truth to offer, is interested in truth or is interested in goodness. And so I was curious about the ways that people might incorporate certain aspects of it into their own sort of twisted philosophy or something. It's sort of like the question I have about why certain people go into medieval studies only to, subvert, everything that they're reading.
Sure. Or to go into Shakespeare studies and it's all about class warfare or something like that, and it has nothing to do with what Shakespeare was actually writing about. Subverting the text. Well, it's another one of these, as I said, that some people read looking for certain kinds of esoteric meanings to feed their pride. The kind of thing that you're talking about, going in medieval studies in order to subvert it, or studying Shakespeare in order to subvert him. That's a matter of pride, too. This was what got me in trouble when I was a young man, when I lost my faith. I wasn't stupid. I was smart. I knew I was smart. But I had a vast, vast excess of intellectual pride. And I thought I saw through all of that stuff about God. And, it wasn't until several years after I came back to faith that I came to realize when I had abandoned God, it wasn't because I told myself I'd been persuaded by good arguments, but in fact there hadn't been any. I just thought I was too smart for all of that. And the intellect is a wonderful, beautiful gift that God gave us. Intellectual pride is the worm in that apple, and it'll devour the whole thing.
Yeah, that's certainly been a huge, probably my principal vice, myself. I never left the church, but it's caused me problems nonetheless. And that brings me to the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I remember reading on your website years ago a very moving account of your youthful nihilism and eventually your exit from it. And the one thing that I remember that stuck with me is your description of yourself as having to sort of continuously, to use a popular word these days, dismantle everything as though it were like a panel of machinery, and to take out everything until nothing functioned properly, because you had to take out everything that smacked of any kind of transcendent meaning. So I wonder if you could tell that story a bit about what it was like to be a nihilist and what got you out of it.
Well, yes, I will. Now, you need to understand, of course, that there's more than one kind of nihilism. There is the pop culture nihilism that says nothing has any meaning. That's cool. Then there is the existential dread kind of nihilism that says nothing has any meaning and we're all perishing. And then there's the macho kind of nihilism that says nothing has any meaning, and I'm one of the tough ones who can know that and still live. Now, my type was the macho nihilism. It was the proud nihilism, but I wasn't living. You're right. I use that metaphor of opening up the access panel in my mind and trying to remove every component that had God's initials on it. But the problem is that we're made in His image. Every component has His initials on it. So you just have
Yeah.
to take out component after component after component. There were fewer and fewer things that I could think about. I couldn't think about persons. I didn't believe in them. I couldn't think about personal responsibility. I didn't think that we were free. I couldn't think about the difference between good and evil. I thought that it was just something that we invented. I loved my wife and children. I really did. But I couldn't even think about that. I couldn't understand it any longer, because love is a commitment of the will to the true good of another person. And I didn't think my commitments were in my control. I didn't believe in persons, and I didn't believe in good. So it was miserable. It was I think God pulled me back after I was pulling out every component one after another, right before I got to the motherboard. And I'm just grateful. It it was a curious thing when he brought me back. It wasn't by, just as I had abandoned him, not by rational argument, but by thinking that I was too smart and saw through all that jazz. He didn't bring me back by arguments either. I'll tell you how I did come back in a minute, but that wasn't it. And I realized sometime later, it used to frustrate me. Why can't I rationally reconstruct what my reasons were at every step for coming back to faith? And I couldn't do it. And then I realized he had to bring me back that way. He had to bring me back in a way that didn't give me an ounce of anything that I could take credit for, because it had been my pride that had been my downfall. So that was the only way. And I'm so grateful for the humiliation of it. But what happened was, I finally, there was one evening I'd had a quarrel with my wife, and I was weeping. She'd gone to bed, and I finally just said, I remembered something that somebody had taught me back in, children's education, Sunday school, when I was a little Baptist boy, and it was that you could pray to God hypothetically. And I said, well, okay, I don't think you're there. I think I'm talking to the wall. But if you are there, you can have me. But you're going to have to show me, because I can't tell anymore. Now, I don't know what I expected or what I was hoping for. Maybe that the walls would open up and I'd hear choirs of angels, and nothing like that happened. Nothing like that happened. In fact, nothing happened that I could tell. And, my tears dried up, and eventually I just sat there for a while longer and finally went to bed myself. But a matter of weeks later, something did start to happen. I believe that this was God's answer. I began to have a perception, an intuition, a recognition. It was as clear as if I'd thought the sky was pink, and one day I walked out and I saw it's been blue all along. I began to realize that my condition was objectively evil. Now, you got to remember, so what? Isn't that obvious? But you have to remember, I was a guy who'd been telling himself that there's no such thing as a difference between good and evil. And here's something that's evil. Augustine had said that the only way that you can get an evil thing is to take a good thing and ruin it. The only thing you can the only way you can get a horrible is to take a wonderful and mess it up. That's the privation theory of evil. And I'd always thought that it was a nifty argument that didn't have anything to plug into it, but now I had something to plug into it. My condition was evil. There must therefore be something good. And I had no idea what it was. And I just started reading, devouring things. I remember I used to devour C.S. Lewis. I read some Augustine, I read this, and I read that, and I read the other. And there came a time, just as I had drifted out of faith, and there had never been a moment at which I thought, I now do not believe. I came back to faith, and there was never a moment that I was aware of crossing over and believing, but at one point I became aware retrospectively. For some time now, I have been believing again. Well, I said he could have me. So what now?
Wow. Yeah.
But I tell you, it was pretty bleak. I never was one to make the pop culture cool kind of nihilism work. The only one that I had a chance with was the bravado that masked the dread. And
Would that be a kind of a Nietzschean thing?
yeah, oh yeah, I out Nietzsche'd Nietzsche. Nietzsche had said at one point, if you really get it, he said words to this effect: if you really get it, there's nothing left but to either laugh or be silent. Because you among the things that you get is that there isn't any propositional truth anymore, so you can't even talk about how it doesn't mean anything. And I thought, well, how can you even laugh or be silent? That's not even left to you anymore. I thought, thinking that there's nothing left except to laugh or be silent, Nietzsche's being far too optimistic there. So I out Nietzsche'd Nietzsche, and was in a very dismal case. But in one respect, I was like him. Nietzsche wanted to be God. He didn't want God to be God. He wanted Friedrich Nietzsche to be God, and that was my problem. I didn't want God to be God. I wanted J Budziszewski to be God, and needless to say, I couldn't fill his shoes.
Wow. Yeah. Anything? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. So I'm grateful to be back, and I'm grateful that he brought me back in a way that I can take no credit for.
Yeah, praise God. Yeah. Anything else that you want to say about that whole period before we move on to another topic?
Well, I wouldn't talk about it at all if it weren't for the fact that it seems to be helpful to some people who are going through some of this. Some of my students are in very dark places. Some other people who've written to me, I get emails sometimes, are in dark places, and so I talk about it. But that's the only reason I do. It's not worth thinking about for its own sake. You know, God can make use even of repented sin, but it needs before it can become good in our own lives. It has to be repented, and then he can do something with it. And in fact, one of the good things that's done for me is this. You mentioned earlier that you first began reading some of my stuff because you were interested in what I had to say about natural law, the natural moral law. Some people who study natural law are interested in trying to figure out, well, what's right and what's wrong, in casuistry and difficult moral problems and things like that. And I do a little of that. Some people are interested in what might be called moral and cultural apologetics. How we persuade people more effectively, and I do a little of that. And some people are interested in the metaphysics of it, the ontology. If there really is a moral law, then what must the universe be like for that to be true? And I do a little bit of that. But something that I do that, so far as I know, nobody else really does much, is that I'm interested in moral self-deception. I'm interested in... Thomas Aquinas had said that the basics of the moral law are the same for everybody. He said both as to rectitude and as to knowledge. In other words, they're right for everybody and at some level known to everybody. Mm-hmm. Well, that means that when I was a nihilist, I wasn't in ignorance of God. I wasn't of his reality. I wasn't in ignorance of right and wrong. I was in denial. And retrospectively, I see that was true. It isn't that I didn't know. It's that I told myself that it wasn't true. So one of the things that interests me keenly is, how is it even possible for us to tell ourselves that we don't know what we really do know? And what does that do to us individually? And more, we have to ask, what does that do to us as a culture? Because the whole culture is going down that road. This is a really eerie phase in history. There have been moral troughs before that Western civilization has gone into. People have become very wicked. But, in those previous ages, they more or less admitted that they were wicked. And now we're in a weird phase in which vice has the high moral ground. And virtue is condemned as Puritanism and as somehow sick-minded. And people deny everything that everybody really knows. Like the wrong of deliberately taking innocent human life, or the fact that men and women are different from each other and need each other, and that there aren't any third or fourth or 96th kinds of them. Why do we lie to ourselves about this? What happens? So I'm interested in that. Maybe if God hadn't allowed me to wallow in that slough of despond, I wouldn't be prepared to inquire into that. So that's another thing to be grateful to him for.
I remember you discussing that self-deception in your book, What We Can't Not Know.
Yes.
It's been probably over a decade since I read it, because I think I was in college when I read it. But I highly recommend people check that out, as well as this new book, because you do deal with that extensively, and it's a fascinating discussion. You mentioned a number of versions of nihilism. You mentioned the pop culture version. You mentioned the existential angst version. You mentioned the Nietzschean bravado version. What about the postmodern stuff that seems to be dominant now, in one way or another?
Yeah, postmodernism, just like in every fallacy, there's something true here. Postmodernists say, well, what we're all about is suspicion of meta-narratives, which is another way of saying nobody gets the big story right. And it's true that there's a lot of lying about the big story, and people say, oh, my big story, maybe the Nazis had this big story that the Aryan race was better than everybody else, and Americans have this big story that free enterprise will be the light to the nations, and this kind of thing. That our nation will be the savior of mankind. People have a big story about this, about the socialist revolution, about whatever. They have all and nobody gets the big story right. Now, and postmodernists, well, okay, there is a lot of lying and there is a lot of self-deception about the big story. But what they miss is that there is a big story. There is a truth. It can be found. And as a matter of fact, if you say nobody gets the big story right, that is their big story. And they claim that they are getting it right. And they're the only ones who get it right, which gives them a superiority to everybody else. Something else that is not unreasonable in postmodernism, but is just taken to a false and fallacious extreme, is that you have a sense in reading the postmodernist writers that life is in pieces, it's fragmented, it's broken. And people even have a difficult time speaking of the continuity of their lives. People will say, and I'm not talking about necessarily postmodernist philosophers or intellectuals, but just people who are in this cultural state. They have difficulty making commitments, keeping commitments. They say, well, I'm into this week. Or this is my relationship right now. Or I'm having this project right now. And people will even say, well, every time you make a decision, it changes you in a different person. So how can you even bother talking about the continuity? That's false. But this sense of brokenness, this sense of futility is based on something that is true. We are fallen. We are broken. We alienated ourselves from the time of our first parents, from God. We're like surgeons who may have marvelous powers, but our hands have been severed. We cut off our own hands, and now we can't sew them back on again. We need the divine surgeon, and that's what postmodernism won't accept. It wants to just stay in this nothing land. It's not really postmodern anyway. It's really ultramodernism. This was where all of modernity was going, and it's just reached a sort of an extreme stage.
Right. Well, this has been a great interview. Thank you so much, Jay, for coming on the show and sharing philosophy, personal stories, anecdotes about your students. It's been wonderful.
Well, I want to add one thing, because we ended on talking about postmodernism and talking about nihilism and all that is a real downer.
Sure.
But the point of the book, How and How Not to Be Happy, is that there is such a thing as happiness. It is attainable. Even the fragmentary happiness of this life, as I say, is nothing to sneeze at. And if we seek God with all our heart, there is something better. I really don't want people to give up. I don't want them to settle. I want them to learn to hunger for that again.
Great. Well, it's a wonderful book. Again, How and How Not to Be Happy. But I do also recommend going to undergroundthomist.org, because there's a real big pile of resources that you can check out there. Not only blog posts, but articles, talks, interviews. You can see all the books that Jay has written. It's a great resource. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Jay, for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me too, and an honor.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please do subscribe. If you'd like to help us out, we are going through our spring fundraising campaign at Catholic Culture. And so you can always help us out. We should have a matching, I'm recording this before the campaign has begun, but if things proceed as usual, we should have a matching grant from some generous donors. And that means that any donation of yours will be matched. And this is what helps us to continue on for the rest of the year. So it's very important. If you'd like to donate specifically towards our podcast network, which is entirely listener funded, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. All right, everybody, thank you for listening, and happy Easter season to you all.